Hey reader, this is Centaur here. We're continuing our tutorial series. Today doing a hopefully shorter video talking through order prioritization. So in our first video, we talked through the basics of how to play the game, reach into the bag, grab an order dice, assign it to a unit, resolve it, move on to the next, finish through all the dice that are in the bag, and you complete a turn. Run through 6 or 7 turns and you're done. In the second one, we talked about what resolving orders actually looks like. So we talked through the 6 orders as well as the officer's unique snap to action and how each of those work together. And so in today's tutorial, we're going to talk over both two mechanics that I didn't want to spend too much time on in the last video because it was kind of running long already, but also helping to avoid some of the analysis paralysis that can set in by giving you some rough concepts and broad strokes for how one might consider assigning your orders. Okay. And so we're going to break these up into 3 primary categories. The first is what I call emergencies. Generally speaking, the first few dice you should be activating on the turn, if these are the case, is you should be dealing with emergencies. And these can take a lot of different forms. So for example, there might be a unit that can score victory points either for yourself or for your opponent. Okay. That should be a high priority target for you in terms of activation, either to activate the unit who can score the points, whether that's removing an enemy unit in a kill point scenario, or whether that's getting a unit safely across an enemy into an enemy deployment zone, or getting them off the board, or potentially picking up a mobile objective like a briefcase or something else like that. In a demolition scenario, it could be making sure that you're getting your guys within 3 inches and not going down, so that way you can, in fact, throw the satchel charges, blow up the thing, whatever. Right? You get the point. Whatever the thing is that gets you victory points for the scenario, you might consider activating that unit. Or it might be activating a unit who can deal with, neutralize, or remove an enemy unit that can score. So if your opponent is trying to get units past you and off of your deployment zone edge through an envelopment or double envelopment style game, then you might consider activating one of your units to counter that unit and remove them before they have a chance to get off the board. The second thing that you might look at is moving a unit who is either in the open and doesn't have any cover, and you want to quickly get them to a place where they'll be a little safer and still effective, or moving a unit and activating a unit who is at risk of being assaulted by an enemy unit, and you're afraid you might lose them in close combat. In either situation, this can be an evacuation. It could also be just going full offense and saying, well, if I'm going to be out in the open, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move up and I'm going to shoot whatever unit it is what might deal with me. Or I might assault the unit that was planning on assaulting me because they're in a position where if I get the drop in on them, then maybe that's more advantageous for me than them getting the drop in on me, right? Or something like that. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, but that is something you might consider a unit that is in danger, okay? The third is activating a unit to remove an enemy order dice. That is to say, if you've drawn your order dice out of the bag and you're pretty sure that you have an advantage when it comes to how many dice are still in the bag, there is a solid strategy of activating one of your dice so that one of their dice also comes out, or potentially multiples of their dice come out, typically because you're either removing the unit or because you're causing the unit to go down, or you're forcing them to reactive fire or something like that, so that the order dice parity remains the same, right? You're still retaining your advantage in the order die pool, so that way you are more likely to be the one guiding the initiative of the turn. And then finally, there's, of course, getting on an objective, but specifically within the last 15 minutes of a game, right? If you know that the game is going to be wrapping soon, getting guys across the board onto an objective, even if you lose some guys in the process, is probably for the best, because a unit that is not scoring is not scoring, right? Earlier in the game, it may not be quite an emergency because sometimes getting to a place first could mean that you're in more danger, right? And it could cause you to lose that unit, and thus they won't be scoring for you anyway. The second group is what I will call prospecting activations. That is to say, you're just going to try something and see what happens, or you're setting up for something that will happen in the future. So, for example, you could choose to fire a mortar or another indirect fire unit to continue them ranging in. Now, this is something we only briefly talked about in the last video, and so we're going to talk about it here. We talked about all those hit modifiers, right? About being at close range or having moved in shot or having lost your assistant or things like that. If that seemed a little overwhelming to you, you might enjoy playing with indirect fire weapons, because indirect fire weapons ignore basically all of those, okay? And they can take a lot of different forms. It could take the form of a medium mortar team like I have here. or a light mortar team or a heavy mortar team. It could take the form of a field artillery piece like this 15 centimeter heavy howitzer for the Germans, but really any howitzer that chooses to fire indirect on a given turn. It could take the form of a self-propelled gun like this Panzer I SIG 33 Bison, for example. It could take a lot of different forms, but invariably they all work the same way, which is when they fire, instead of looking at how many pins are on them and what, whether or not they have inexperienced levels or, anything like that, all the normal hit modifiers. Instead, when they're firing indirect in a parabolic arch, you first check to just see if they have line of sight, as per normal, which could be drawn from themselves, from their own crew, or it could be drawn from a friendly spotter who isn't spotting for something else. And you roll the dice to hit, and you're looking for a 6. And if you fail to get a 6, then note it. And as long as you fire at the same unit and it hasn't moved since the turn before, and all that you've been doing since then is shooting at them, then you now range in on a 5. Now you're looking for a 5 or a 6. And if they haven't moved away and you continue to be shooting every single turn, you could dream it up to a 4, a 3, eventually hitting on a 2+ until you eventually hit. And once you hit, your boys lock in that particular coordinate, and it's going to be 2s to hit from that point on. So in an ideal world, you want to do this pretty quickly, right? But this means there are advantages to maybe doing it pretty late in one turn, shooting, and then possibly doing it pretty early in another turn. So in general, if I don't have any immediate emergencies, my first activation on a turn is going to be firing the mortar. And mortars being the best example of this because they have to fire in an indirect fashion. So howitzers and other field guns and self-propelled guns that have the howitzer keyword, they can fire direct or indirect. So they can use the normal hit modifiers, typically when they're up nice and close, or they can fire indirect using this form of ranging in. And if that's the case, you might be able to get 2 shots off before the unit that you're shooting at actually gets to activate. If they've already activated and you shoot at them the first turn, and then the next turn you activate before that unit activates again, boom, you got 2 chances of trying to hit them and trying to then do pins and do wounds to the unit. Can be very, very effective. The second thing you might consider doing is just setting a unit on ambush. If you have a unit that you know is in a pretty good position and your opponent has to use that corridor that they're looking down, it might be advantageous to just say, well, I don't want to fire at you now because right now you're in cover, but I know you need to get to this objective, or I know that you need to get across the table. So I'm just going to go on ambush and I'm going to wait until you take that advance or run action and move out of there. Okay? Maybe it triggers soon, maybe it doesn't. You're setting up for later in the turn or even next turn. The next thing you can do is you can do force concentration with an officer's UMen snap 2 action. So you might just say, well, what I really would like to do, since I don't have any emergencies going on, is I'm going to activate my officer, and then he's going to issue 2 to 4, for Germans 3 to 5 orders to other units. I'm going to pull a whole bunch of my dice out of the bag effectively and take a whole bunch of turns in a row so that I can really utilize this effectively. Most commonly, this would be used for an officer who's maybe commanding a transport and maybe units in said transport to quickly move up and everybody drops out, so that way the transport doesn't get blown up and you don't end up losing men in the wreckage, right? This is one of the biggest reasons why you might do something like that. The fourth thing you might do is you might just pin a troublesome unit. You want to just activate one of your units with a fire or advanced order and shoot at an enemy unit. Maybe it removes some models, maybe it even removes the unit. That's not important. The important thing is at least we're going to try to put some pins down range so that units are less effective. You'll remember from the last tutorial, as you start adding pins, they have to take that order test in order to try to do whatever it is that they're being ordered to do, unless they're choosing to go down. In which case, it can be very effective to just throw some pins, throw some pins, throw some pins. So that way a unit's locked down. And worst case scenario, maybe they just rally. Best case scenario, they don't do whatever it is that the other general planned on them doing that turn, right? And then the final thing you can do is you can run a unit toward a deployment zone or objective without necessarily needing to immediately score or anything like that. You're just moving the ball, so that way it's a little easier to set up for actual scoring in a future turn. This, again, can be pretty dangerous. I would only recommend doing this if there's not a good chance that the enemy is going to activate a unit to shoot at them or remove them, or if you know that you're going to be running from, say, behind a building to like into a ruin, right? Or behind a ruin, right? Or something like that, where you know that you're going to get a good amount of cover. You're going to be pretty safe after the activation is complete. And then the final set of actions you can do is you can perform what we call a delaying action. This is where you're basically you're intentionally ceding initiative to the opponent, and you want them to do things so that your other units can then take advantage of whatever it is that they did. Okay. So for example, if your opponent is holed up nice and good, they're running a gunline army, they're sitting in the back, they're getting ready to shoot at you, and you don't want to move up just yet, but you also want to know which of their units they're planning on ambushing or which ones they're planning on moving forward in order to take ground, you might just rally one of your units that has a heavy number of pins on it. Be careful, because if that unit then gets shot at, you might have to repeat the rally action on the following turn. But the point is, you might just say, hey, for right now, I'm just going to remove all the pins that are on this unit by successfully performing my rally order, and then we're good, for setup for the next turn. And I haven't really moved the ball. I haven't really done anything aggressive. I haven't risked very much. I'm just doing this so that way I'm a little more effective when the time comes, and I'm letting the opponent now dictate what's happening and let them come to me. The second thing you can do is you can give a down order to a unit that's in reserve. If the unit is in reserve and you don't plan to bring it in this turn, then by assigning it a down order, you've assigned your dice, but you haven't changed anything on the board. Now, the enemy has more chances of maybe they got to bring in their own units. Now you know where the enemy bazooka is, or you know where the enemy big submachine gun squad is. You know where the enemy tanks are, so you can counter with your own anti-tank assets. You're doing a delaying action. You're slowing down your stuff. You're giving away less intelligence on what you want to do, not forcing yourself into things that you don't want, so that way you can react better to what your opponent's doing. And then the final one is kind of a cheeky one because it doesn't always actually do anything, which is you can assign an ambush order to a transport or a tow. And the reason why you would do this, especially with a transport that doesn't have any weapons, comes down to the fact that sometimes that's the only action you can actually take. Because for vehicles, they can't go down, because that they only get a down order when the crew is shaken up by the enemy performing some form of action, okay? Or you run it into a ditch or something like that. You sometimes don't want your vehicle doing a run or advance action. Sometimes you like them where they are and you don't necessarily want them to move around. They're tucked nicely behind a building, so they're pretty safe. They're not going to be removed by enemy rifle fire. Or maybe they're providing cover for a unit, so you don't really want to move them around all that much. Maybe they don't have a gun on them. Quite a few transports don't. And so you're like, well, I can't really perform a fire action either, which means your only two options really are rally or down. Oh, sorry, rally or ambush. And while, yes, you could perform a rally action, if you don't have any pins on you, it doesn't really do anything. And technically, the rally requires you to take an order test, which means you might fail it, right? And then that means you might have to move. You might end up reversing, which could be really bad. So instead, you take the ambush action, because the ambush action, if you don't have any pins on you, doesn't require you to take a test. You just sit there. And while you won't technically ever use the ambush, it allows the unit to stay put. And once again, it's kind of a throwaway action. You're trying to force the enemy to come to you. You're just spending a little bit more time doing this, especially if you're one of those armies that took like 3 or 4 really cheap tows just to pad your order dice count, right? In this case, sometimes it can be very useful to just say, I'm going to throw those away. Okay. But these are your 3 primary categories and the way that I would recommend approaching them. In general, start with emergencies. Do those first. Okay. Then after that, you can do some prospecting if you want to, or if you just don't know enough about the enemy, or the enemy's sitting back and they're really safe and you want them to have a chance to kind of come out or risk something, then you might then consider just doing some delaying actions so that you can maintain the flow and momentum as you want to. Okay. Hopefully that's useful. We're going to return back to effectively how to play the game in our next tutorial, but I thought it was useful right after talking through orders to maybe talk a little bit about which orders. So hopefully it gives you some general categories that will help you to be more effective with the army that you're running. If you found this very helpful, please let us know. If there are other types of actions or other things that you think would be useful, note those in the comments down below. Would love to see them. Maybe I'll even make an adjustment to the video and do a re-record, because again, this one's relatively short. And I will see you next time.